Good morning, and welcome to the first news conference of the Coalition Against NATO Expansion. I'm Bill Lind from the Free Congress Foundation, and with me is John Isaacs from the Council for a Livable World. One of the rare phenomena in Washington is to see the left and the right agreeing on anything. And even more rare is a situation where major organizations on the left and on the right actually work together. The Coalition Against NATO Expansion is one of those most rare situations where, in fact, we do have major organizations from both sides of the political spectrum joined together in a common cause. On the right, we have, in addition to the Free Congress Foundation, Eagle Forum, the Media Research Center, and the American Defense Institute. And John, on the left?
On the left, we have Council for a Livable World, Union of Concerned Scientists, Peace Action, and Center for Defense Information.
The question is, what sort of issue could possibly bring about such a broad coalition? And the issue is obviously the expansion of NATO. Proposal initially to admit three new members, and then probably up to as many as 12. The first concern that the organizations that belong to the Coalition Against NATO Expansion share is that we are making a move of enormous strategic import, committing American money in the billions of dollars, and ultimately committing the lives of young Americans to the defense of a growing number of countries with almost no debate, serious consideration, and certainly no engagement of the American public, the agency which ultimately must back up any such commitments. It is not the children of senators and congressmen who go to war. Our belief, the coalition's belief, is that it is a crime against democracy if the expansion of NATO continues to be treated as a Washington insider deal. This country does not need a Tonkin Gulf resolution for Central and Eastern Europe. If there's one lesson that I believe both the right and the left can draw from the Vietnam War, it is that important commitments of American prestige, and again, ultimately American troops, should not be made without participation by the American people. The American people have no reason to support a commitment done as an insider deal in the dark. The Coalition Against NATO Expansion is determined to do everything in its power to create the necessary debate both in Congress and among the American people so that this issue gets the thorough airing and careful consideration that it merits. The arguments against NATO expansion, and the coalition very explicitly is against NATO expansion, are strategic, political, and financial. Let me touch briefly on the strategic, and then I'm going to ask John Isaacs to talk about the other two. In the course of this century, our culture, the West, has fought three terrible civil wars: the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. We don't usually think of those as civil wars, but if we view the world as a mix not merely of nations but of cultures, and increasingly of cultures in conflict, then that is what these were. The price we paid was enormous, somewhere around 50 million people dead, incalculable losses of whole cities, and the very moral fiber of the West, ultimately. By a miracle, at the end of this terrible century, we have been offered the opportunity to put an end to these terrible conflicts. The fall of communism in Central Europe and the old Soviet Union have opened the door for the reunification of the West, a West that can and must include Russia. Russia is also culturally a Christian nation. Russia is part of the West. And if Russia is excluded from the West, as too often in the past she has been, then the consequences invariably are once again a civil war within the West sooner or later. This unique, tremendous opportunity is now being thrown away by an establishment here in Washington that is either unwilling to think strategically or incapable of thinking strategically. Because the expansion of NATO, and NATO, let me remind you, is a military alliance, can only be directed against Russia. The message that NATO expansion sends to Russia is unmistakable. You're out and you're never going to be in. In our view, this is a tragedy. And as the old saying goes, it's worse than a crime, it's a blunder. The opportunity to reintegrate the West is not likely to occur again if we throw it away now. And those who propose to do so by expanding NATO have an enormous burden of explanation that they must answer to the American people for. So far, we have heard nothing from them on this subject. True, they have beaten and cajoled the current Russian government into silence. But the entire Russian polity across the political spectrum knows and says among itself that this is directed against Russia because geography means it can't be anything else. It cannot be directed against Japan or India or China. The geography for that simply isn't there. It can be directed only against Russia, and it is directed against Russia. In our view, this is a strategic blunder as great as any that has been committed in the West in this century, as great as the terrible errors of 1914, as great as anything that we can imagine. We are throwing away the chance of the century, literally, in pursuit of little more than some arms contracts for the manufacturers of American fighter planes and tanks, and the usual promises of campaign funds and jobs for constituents on Capitol Hill. And that reaches into the next area, which is political. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to John Isaacs.
Thank you, Bill Lind, and thank you to the organizations that together are joining here to form the Coalition Against NATO Expansion. My name is John Isaacs, and I'm president of Council for Livable World, and I'm here to uphold the left side of the coalition, along with, as you heard before, Union of Concerned Scientists, Peace Action, and Center for Defense Information. The organizations in this room have profound differences on many foreign policy and national security issues. Needless to say, we have not found ourselves often in the same room planning strategy and in the same press conferences. But we have found, much to our surprise, profound agreement that the decision of NATO to accept 3 new countries and perhaps many more is a serious and grave mistake for the United States in the post-Cold War era. I recently read a column by Phyllis Schlafly and found, much to my surprise, her arguments are my arguments. We hope that our coming together today and joining with other groups on the left and the right, and in fact the center, will generate a debate on this vital national security issue, both in Washington, D.C. and around the country. Bill Lind mentioned the strategic reasons to oppose NATO enlargement. I'd like to focus briefly on some of the political concerns as well. President Clinton, Majority Leader Trent Lott, and Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Jesse Helms are determined to push this critical decision through the United States Senate with a lemming-like march to judgment, using as a primary argument at this point, it's a done deal. You can't stop, it's too late. We're here to say it is not a done deal. This undertaking to expand NATO will involve Americans in major new commitments and risk major new military involvements, and should be extensively debated, not only in the U.S. Congress, but around the country. Even more disturbing is the heavy involvement in this debate of the defense contractor lobbyists working in the pro-enlargement campaign, contractors who see in the horizon at lucrative new markets for weapon sales in Central Europe. We are also concerned about the extremely high costs of expanding NATO, costs which have been variously estimated as high as $125 billion and as low as $1.2 billion. The $1.2 billion being the most recent estimate put out by NATO. And in fact, in recent weeks, NATO officials and American leaders have been trying to lowball the costs of NATO enlargement because of the obvious concern of members of Congress and parliamentarians in the other NATO countries about the money that will need to be appropriated. Interestingly enough, the details behind the most recent NATO estimate of $1.2 billion have been classified, being kept from both the American public, other publics, and parliamentarians. One thing is clear. Existing NATO members are little interested in spending new money on NATO, and the potential new countries of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary cannot afford to spend a lot of new money on weapons to join this elite body. Also clear is that Uncle Sam will be asked to pick up a much larger part of the bill than is now conceded. We will be working as part of this coalition to expand the debate across the country. In fact, we challenge State Department representatives to join us in a debate. Let the issues come forward, let the debate begin in the months ahead. We will be glad to debate them anywhere across the country. We will also be cooperating with parallel efforts, such as a new group that's about to be announced shortly called No to NATO Expansion Speakers Tour, which is sending distinguished experts across the country to California, Oregon, Illinois, Wisconsin, Connecticut, New Jersey, Florida. One final point. While we don't expect today's announcement to produce an instant shift in the debate, we do hope that this unusual coalition will force both policymakers and pundits to take a brand new look at the issue of NATO enlargement and the profound implications of this decision. We are confident that a close examination of the implications of NATO enlargement will lead this country away from this mistaken policy.
Let me just add a little bit from the right on John's challenge to the State Department to debate us, the coalition against NATO expansion, in cities all over America. The State Department loves to go around the world preaching the merits of democracy to all and sundry. Well, we're challenging them to practice it. And if they refuse to discuss this vital commitment before the American people in debates around this country in the major cities where ordinary people can come and listen, then let us hear no more cant from them about the merits of democracy, because they don't mean a word of it. We do intend to take our campaign against NATO enlargement to the American people. We realize that the answer to the money being promised on Capitol Hill through the defense contractors is the voices of ordinary American citizens. We are fortunate to have in our initial coalition two organizations which have a great deal of strength at the grassroots. And we're going to ask them to come forward now and say a little bit about what they are going to do to take the question of NATO enlargement to the American people. I would like to call first on Chris Ardizone from Eagle Forum.
Thank you very much. My name is Chris Ardizone, and I'm the Executive Director of Eagle Forum, and it is with pleasure that we join in this coalition against the expansion of NATO. This is an unusual coalition. It has members from all across the political spectrum, and this really reflects the ideas and thoughts of the American people. One of the great things about our system of government is that when the people speak out, our elected representatives do listen. And at Eagle Forum, we are committed to taking this message to grassroots Americans and have them speak out about their thoughts about it. With the expansion of NATO comes many questions that haven't been answered. And probably many of them are not even answerable. Who will we be protecting the NATO countries from? Why admit some of the Warsaw Pact countries and not others? And how much is it going to cost us, both in dollars and U.S. lives? The biggest question is, why should Americans commit to defend faraway European borders that have been the locus of ethnic, nationalist, and religious disputes for hundreds of years? Make no mistake about it, NATO is a life and death U.S. promise to go to war to protect the other members. The American people deserve the opportunity to be heard, and at Eagle Forum we are going to take the message to our grassroots and to grassroots Americans of all various political stripes and get them to speak out about what they believe a sound foreign policy and national defense strategy for our country is. And some people ask, Eagle Forum is a conservative, grassroots, quote-unquote, pro-family organization. Why would you all be interested in this issue? We have long been interested in sound foreign affairs and a strong national defense policy, because without strong national defense and a sound foreign affairs, you can't have strong families. And our members are very interested in this issue and a variety of other issues that have to do with foreign affairs, and they are very excited to get involved, to talk to their senators, and even the members of the House. We are calling on the House to hold hearings on the budget issues and to hold real debates on what this will mean to the future of our armed forces and the future of our country. And so we encourage both houses of Congress to hold extensive hearings and to listen to what the American people are saying on this vital issue. Thank you.
And from the left, Gordon Clark of Peace Action.
Hi, my name is Gordon Clark. I'm the Executive Director of Peace Action, formerly Sane Freeze, the nation's largest grassroots peace and disarmament organization. Tomorrow night, when President Clinton speaks about NATO expansion, he's undoubtedly going to talk about the calm and stability that it's going to bring over Europe. As you can tell, the members of the panel here completely disagree with that. I would second what Bill has said, that in fact we feel that the Clinton administration is throwing away a historic opportunity to bring peace to the European continent. And there are many questions, in fact, which aren't being answered, questions about how our sons and daughters are going to be committed to conflicts in Europe, questions of why we are remilitarizing Europe at a time when we should be demilitarizing Europe, questions of just how much money, American taxpayer money, is going to be spent on this. Again, estimates go anywhere from $1.5 billion to $125 billion. And finally, and in some ways perhaps most importantly, will this maneuver in fact rekindle the Cold War that we all thought was behind us? Many of us believe it will, by pressing Russia to place greater reliance on nuclear weapons in the face of this military expansion against them. As other folks have mentioned here, it is indeed an unusual coalition of left and right that comes together. And I think it's an extraordinary time in Washington when this is not the most unusual case of strange bedfellows going on in Washington, D.C. But I do think that ultimately this is going to be far, far and away the most important case going on, far more important than the scandals which are now rocking the Clinton White House. My organization has certainly said at times that we are very concerned about the partisan wrangling that goes on, the partisan bitterness that goes on in Washington, D.C. But frankly, right now, we are even more concerned when official Washington gets together and tells us that we have nothing to worry about with this major, major policy initiative, truly the greatest one to go on since the beginning of the Cold War over 50 years ago. We think the American people should be worried when official Washington gets together and says, as John has said, it's a done deal, nothing to worry about. We think the American people should be worried when official Washington gets together and says that there's going to be virtually no cost attached to defending a new continent in a major policy initiative. We certainly think that the American people should be worried and should be clutching their wallets and pocketbooks when officials from Lockheed Martin, the world's largest military contractor, is leading the lobbying effort to push this new foreign policy initiative of NATO expansion. Perhaps worst of all for us, and I think worst for American democracy, again, is the complete lack of public and media debate on this issue so far. There used to be a time in this country when public debate on major foreign policy issues was considered the norm and not the exception. And quite frankly, at this point, I feel that there has been less public and media debate on this issue than there has been pregame analysis of the most recent Super Bowl. And I would also add, look at what official estimates of that game turned out to be. Because official Washington and Clinton, the Congress, the State Department doesn't seem to have any real interest in sponsoring true debate in the American public on this historic initiative, it's up to us, organizations, grassroots organizations, to do that. And that is exactly what we intend to do. This coming Wednesday will be the launching of the No to NATO expansion debate, which is going to be happening at 15 cities across America, from New York, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and a number of cities in between. People who are joining us on this tour include Dr. Alla Yaroshinskaya, who's advisor to President Yeltsin and a former member of the Russian Parliament, Ann Clyde, who's a member of Parliament from the United Kingdom, Sir Hugh Beach, who's a retired four-star British general, former Senator Gary Hart, and a number of other noted experts from both the East and West, military, diplomatic experts who are going to be raising these questions that we are here today about NATO expansion. I have the press conference is going to be this coming Wednesday here in Washington, D.C., here I believe in this National Press Club, and we truly hope, along with our colleagues on the left and on the right, that this is going to open up a true debate among the American public on, again, what is we consider the most historic and ill-thought-out foreign policy initiative of this century.
In addition to the 8 organizations which have founded the Coalition Against NATO Expansion, we also have a distinguished and rapidly growing advisory council. It includes retired Senator Gordon Humphrey of New Hampshire, Dr. Freddie Clay, Ambassador Jack Matlock, and Professor Richard Pipes. I would like to call now on 2 members of that advisory council to give us their thoughts and their ideas as to where this is going to go. The first is Ted Galen Carpenter from Cato Institute.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm Ted Galen Carpenter, Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. I want to emphasize that my appearance here today is in my as a private citizen, not as a representative of the Cato Institute. I think it is increasingly clear that advocates of NATO expansion engage in an exercise of strategic evasions and wishful thinking. If you listen to Secretary Albright and other proponents of expansion, you would swear that an enlarged NATO is little more than an institutional mechanism whereby everyone can gather in the center of Europe for a group hug. It is portrayed as largely a political organization, but we need a dose of reality. NATO has always, to be sure, had some political dimension, but it has never been and is not now primarily a political organization. It is a military alliance, and extending that alliance into a new area entails very serious security obligations. And there is nothing worse than for the United States to undertake such obligations without realizing that we might be called upon someday to carry out those obligations. Again, proponents seem to assume that the Article 5 guarantee in the North Atlantic Treaty, that provision that provides that an attack on any member of the alliance is considered an attack on all, will never be challenged. So we don't have to worry about unpleasant issues such as cost or credibility. We can expand the alliance on the cheap, as the Pentagon has alleged and the NATO itself has provided in its most recent cost estimates. Now, anyone who believes that a military alliance can carry out in a credible way serious commitments on less than $2 billion over a 10-year period is smoking something other than tobacco. That estimate does not even pass the straight face test. Again, we ought to be serious about the consequences of expansion. There has never been in history a military alliance that is directed against no one. That is a contradiction in terms. Military alliances always, either explicitly or at least implicitly, have an adversary. And as Bill has pointed out quite clearly, the only logical major adversary for the alliance is Russia. But there are other problems, and we should remember this. Article 5 does not simply state that members must come to the aid of a fellow member under an attack by an expansionist great power. We would have an obligation to assist a member that gets into a fight involving an adversary of any sort. And if you look at the situation in Central and Eastern Europe, that ought to make every American uneasy. We have, for example, the border between one of NATO's proposed new members, Poland, and Belarus, one of the most corrupt, unstable countries in the international system, a literal powder keg waiting to explode. We also have some problems between Hungary and three of its neighbors, Slovakia, Romania, and Serbia, involving the treatment of Hungarian minorities in those countries. Now, NATO has had a great deal of difficulty over the years with the relationship between Greece and Turkey. This has been a perennial headache for the alliance. Is it really smart for U.S. policymakers to undertake commitments that involve more situations of that sort? That's what NATO expansion means. The future of the alliance, if we're lucky, will mean more Bosnia-style quagmires. That's if we're lucky. If you liked NATO in Bosnia, you will love NATO expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. And the Bosnia precedent, I think, ought to be troubling in another respect. We have the wishful thinking in terms of cost estimates by the proponents of enlargement. Let us remember that the Bosnia mission was supposed to be a one-year mission costing $1.5 billion. That was the original estimate. We now have a mission of unlimited duration at a cost of $8 billion, and the meter is still running. Senators need to ask a lot of hard questions to Secretary Albright, to Secretary Cohen, and other administration officials, and not just accept this notion that NATO expansion is an exercise in benign political symbolism. This is a very serious exercise, and one that could cost Americans dearly, and I don't mean just in dollars. Thank you.
And lastly, Jonathan Dean from Union of Concerned Scientists and a member of the Advisory Council.
Good morning. I am Jonathan Dean, the advisor for international security issues of the Union of Concerned Scientists. I've been involved with NATO since the early 50s when I helped get Germany into NATO as a member. NATO in its present form continues useful, and it provides all of the defense that Europe needs. On the other hand, the enlargement concept is a serious mistake. And the aspect of NATO expansion, which I think is most threatening for the United States and which should cause greatest concern in the U.S. Senate, is the boundless nature of this project. There are now 12 official candidates for NATO membership. 3 European neutral countries are also thinking of joining. The Baltic states and Romania are scheduled for the next round. If the Baltic states appear to be making progress, Ukraine will want in. That gives us 16 candidates, doubling the current membership of NATO. The Central Asian Republic of Azerbaijan has also indicated interest. In fact, any member of the Partnership for Peace is eligible to apply. There are 27 of these, in addition to present NATO members. Now, there's literally no end of this enterprise in sight. The administration refuses to place any limits on it. Consequently, there is no end to the U.S. security commitments the project involves, to its costs and its risks. In the next round of enlargement, if NATO commits to defend the Baltic states and Romania, in order to make good on these commitments, then large numbers of NATO and U.S. ground, air, and naval forces will have to move into the Baltic Sea to the north and also into the Black Sea in the south. This will be a gigantic military pincers movement around the heartland of Russia, like the one that Hitler attempted. Unless it's handled very differently than it's being handled now, this project will create the conditions for a very dangerous long-term confrontation with Russia. The official Russian national security doctrine adopted last December states explicitly that Russia considers that NATO expansion threatens its national security. This is a serious statement that cannot be fobbed off or ignored. To make an enduring enemy of the world's largest country with the world's largest nuclear arsenal and with endless capacity to cause difficulties for the United States is an enormous cost. And this is especially the case for a project whose immediate object of securing democracy in Eastern Europe can be achieved by other means without any additional cost or risk. Thanks.
That concludes the formal part of this news conference. We have copies of the statement, the founding statement of the Coalition Against NATO Expansion on the table outside the door. A number of the member organizations have also brought copies of their own papers on NATO expansion, and I would urge you to feel free to take copies of those as well. We are now open for questions. Yes.
Mr. Lynn, Bill Small, Bloomberg Radio. I guess I'm curious, I would assume you all have done your analysis far and wide. What happens in the event that the Senate votes down NATO expansion? What happens in terms of U.S. relations with Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, most of which have indicated that obviously that they're quite interested in NATO membership and would be...
Well, those countries need us far more than we need them. And I do not foresee any significant change in our relations with any of those countries. Their need for commercial ties with us, for diplomatic ties with us, will remain very strong. And in turn, to be quite blunt about it, there's not much they have to offer us. So I think it's very clearly a one-way street here, and I think that one-way street leads to them continuing to want to be on our good side.
I think there's a further answer to that question.
But if you do it at the mics, I appreciate it.
All right, sure. NATO will continue under those circumstances. The Partnership for Peace will continue under those circumstances. And the current enlargement of the European Union, which will get started in March, and of which all of the candidates for NATO membership, the official candidates except Albania and Macedonia, are on the list. That too will continue. And I would imagine that if this situation does come to pass, that there will be increased interest in the other unnamed security organization in Europe, the Organization for Security and Cooperation, which, if the major members, like the United States, gave it more support and more money, would indeed gain in seriousness and public attention.
Let me just add, the ambassador makes a very important point. There are many vehicles for bringing the countries of Central and Eastern Europe into closer ties with the West. The most important and the most appropriate, very clearly, is the European Union, not a military alliance, which, again, the point's been made by a number of the speakers, must by its nature be directed against someone. That is, of course, not true of something like the European community. Other questions? Yes.
Do you have any support from members of senators? A couple senators have spoken out against NATO expansion in the past, but seem to have gone moot on the issue. Do you have any base of support within the Senate to start your campaign?
John, I'm not sure. You've been kind of watching this more closely than we have. I'm not sure that there's anyone who has gone public yet, but I'll let you address that.
The Senate, of course, has not been in session for the last 3 months, and so senators have been pretty quiet on this issue and most issues. We are hopeful that with the Congress returning tomorrow, that several senators who have been quiet to this point will raise their voices and question and say that they formally oppose NATO enlargement. There are a number of senators who indicated during hearings and other discussions that they're seriously concerned about NATO enlargement. This was last fall, but they were not prepared to oppose outright NATO enlargement. We hope that they will get this courage and they will raise the level of concern to public opposition in the next couple weeks.
I would also add that, as you've heard this morning, these senators are going to be from the grassroots on this issue. I think that it is one of the Washington laws is the law of conservation of enemies. And if senators don't think there's going to be opposition to something, they're not going to come out and risk making enemies in a hopeless cause. Our message to the Senate, the message of this news conference, the message of the founding of this organization is precisely that there is going to be opposition. There is going to be very serious opposition. There's going to be thoughtful opposition. There is going to be widespread opposition among the American public. And I think that will give the significant number of senators who themselves are uncomfortable about this and have been saying privately that they are uncomfortable about this, the platform they need and the impetus they need to go public. Other questions?
Other than Bruce Jackson's membership in a committee that's thrown a few dinner parties, do you have any evidence of defense contractors bankrolling or pushing this thing?
Oh, absolutely. I worked as staff on Capitol Hill for 13 years myself. I have many friends still up there, and they tell me they're there like flies at a July picnic. Any further questions? Very well. Again, I suggest you take a look at the founding statement of the Coalition Against NATO Expansion and at the papers the organizations who are members have produced. They're on the table outside. Thank you for coming.
I'm scared because the news is a response to his visit to the river crack. I'm still going to